Today, we will talk about the US economy just hit a major inflection point. Dalia, one of the world's most respected macroeconomic investors, took the time to talk with CNBC last week, and in this discussion, which is currently going viral around the internet, he explained the exact position of the US economy, why he doesn't expect interest rates to fall substantially anytime soon, and why, unless drastic action is taken, the United States seems to be at an inflection point where the debt snowball could really start to gather momentum. Like and subscribe to our channel to keep watching amazing stuff. Let's continue. Returning to Ray Dalio, the first thing Ray explains to us is how investors view bond yields, and this is crucial information to grasp the core of the US debt crisis. In general, the bond yield should be roughly equal to the estimated inflation rate that we determine will occur over time. That number is likely to be in the range of 3 to 3.5%, and that is the correct amount. A real interest rate must exist above that. But otherwise, individuals who own assets or debt must earn a return that exceeds the rate of inflation by around 1.5%. That will put you close to 4.5% interest rates, and you can see movement in that range. Investors therefore divide their analysis of the yield we lock in by purchasing government bonds into two parts: the expected rate of inflation in the future and your actual return on top of that. Therefore, your real return is 0 if you purchase a bond at 3% and inflation is 3%. Your actual return is 2% if inflation is 1%. The real return is negative 2% if inflation is 5%. You get the idea. In light of this, it is currently widely believed that inflation will remain stable at about 3%. This implies that bond coupon rates, which are what we're seeing, are roughly 4.5% when investors account for, say, a real return of 1.5%. The key takeaway, though, is that bonds are only appealing if they can yield a return that exceeds inflation. Therefore, the current US inflation rate is roughly 3.2%. Therefore, in order to sell its bonds, the government must provide a coupon rate that is at least higher than that. Otherwise, no one would be willing to buy. Yes, that prepares us to address the second problem, which is the crucial issue of bond supply and demand. Put another way, the government must sell a significant amount of bonds since it can only create a limited number of bonds, roughly equal to the size of the deficit. Therefore, the government must sell an enormous amount of government bonds to investors in order to cover or plug the gap between spending and income, since the US runs a deficit, meaning it spends more than it brings in. In order to plug it, they sell a ton of bonds. Ray sees an issue with the US current bond sales, which are at record highs and will only increase over time. However, he is worried that the bond buyer flow is now ceasing, and that there is a significant risk when we consider who is buying those bonds and whether they have a sufficient appetite, since a large number of bondholders have suffered losses as a result. Not only do banks fall within this category, central banks, Japanese investors, and so on do as well. Thus, a supply and demand problem exists. These are the principles that will guide it, albeit there will be some wiggles around. The US ultimately needs to sell a lot of bonds, which is a basic cause for concern. They have to promptly address the shortfall in order to prevent it. The issue, though, is that interest in those bonds is beginning to decline. The Treasury itself admits that the market for US bonds is becoming less active. First of all, the Federal Reserve is no longer purchasing them. Beyond that, though, consider the other significant purchasers of US Treasury bonds: China, Japan, and the UK. Given the continued mismanagement of the US debt issue and the destruction of their government bond portfolios over the last several years, all these large foreign buyers are truly putting their patience to the test yet. Since supply and demand are all related, the bond coupon is a cause for concern. Because there will be an enormous number of bonds that the US needs to sell, the interest rate that they must pay on those bonds will therefore need to remain extremely high for an extended period of time. Additionally, they must offer a deal that will genuinely excite customers enough to sell them all. This, however, creates another issue because the US is now taking on a lot more debt, which means that they will eventually have to pay a high interest rate that will drain more and more of their cash. We are beginning to reach this turning point. We therefore have a debt problem going forward because absent that issue, you cannot continue to accrue debt at a rate greater than that of revenue. In order to ensure that creditors receive a sufficient return while maintaining a balance between supply and demand, we are witnessing a need for an increase in real interest rates. That's how it appears to me then. Therefore, we must continue to offer a high interest rate to the creditor, as the right says. However, that is undoubtedly a serious issue in and of itself. People have to give up a lot more of their money in the form of increased mortgage payments, since high interest rates actually affect them, which puts an uncomfortable strain on their finances. In the context of the economy, a great deal of money was transmitted to a large number of recipients in the form of checks and similar payments. As a result of the government sector's dismal performance, the household sector performed well. In order to improve the situation for the home and corporate sectors, they purposefully took on more debt. And then there's the increase in interest rates, which causes savings of money to steadily decline. Additionally, when loan maturities increase over time, they steadily tighten credit. We've now reached a situation where the Federal Reserve printed a significant amount of money to purchase all of the bonds that the government had previously sold. However, eventually that loan becomes due, meaning the US government must reimburse the Federal Reserve. When that time arrives, the government simply prints more treasury bonds and raises additional funds to cover the maturing debt instead of actually repaying the original amount. But in an atmosphere when interest rates are really high, that results in a situation where a lot of debt starts to roll over. They are therefore taking on substantially larger interest payments when they refinance that debt. This is a turning point where debts have the potential to balloon out of control. The government is forced to issue more bonds at higher rates as the deficit widens and existing debt is being refinanced at higher interest rates. This implies that paying interest becomes a much larger burden, one that could be accomplished by the government issuing even more bonds to raise the necessary funds. If we sell additional bonds, we will need to attract more buyers, but who will buy them then? As a result, the interest rate must increase more, and eventually, as the debt snowballs, we will find ourselves having to take out loans in order to pay off our debt. Additionally, there's a mechanism that indicates debt service is beginning to intrude on expenditure when debt growth continues to outpace income growth. This process applies to both the government and individuals, and as that occurs, you'll need to accumulate debt in order to maintain your current level of spending, as well as how that functions. We are reaching the stage where it is accelerating, which is what causes the supply and demand issue. As with our mortgage, the government must pay its debt more frequently. When mortgage payments rise, we cut spending, but the government struggles to do so. Instead, they go deeper into debt and raise money to cover rising prices. However, as Ray Dalio said, that's the start of the debt snowball. Finding customers for all the debt without offering higher coupons to sell bonds becomes a bigger concern. This is a tricky issue because 40% of our debt is sold to foreigners, and the internal political and social conflict issues are making buyers of US Treasury bonds less likely to invest more. So American politics is concerned with controlling this debt crisis and other issues, which is hard to hear because the US has a path out of this hole. Simply solve the deficit, make more, and spend less, as Ray advises. The only issue is that earning more means raising taxes and spending less means cutting healthcare, social security, infrastructure, the military, etc. for an entire nation. Both choices are politically unpopular. We return to the core question. How good will we be at talking about strong? Also, economically strong means financially strong. Basically, financial strength is earning more than spending. Is your income statement good? A nation? Is our income statement good? Do we have a strong balance sheet with more assets than liabilities? The worse it is, the worse the long-term situation. This is merely seen in the numbers, just numbers, nearing that turning point. We're focusing on the country's income statement to increase revenue and decrease expenses to return to a profit. Once the revenue statement improves, correct the balance sheet, pay down loans, and use the cash you create to reduce debt, clearly a major economic issue. This is it for today. See you next time.